Hello, I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro.
Welcome to Shake and Not Burn. Every day we're bombarded with headlines of crisis and disruption, from climate shocks to inequality to AI upheaval.
But behind the noise are choices, patterns, and opportunities. What we need is sustainability literacy, the clarity and confidence to interpret complexity, see trade-offs, and make decisions.
Our podcast goes beyond the headlines to uncover how real people are tackling change and what we can learn from them.
You can use these ideas to stay steady, even unshakable, in a world that feels uncertain.
This is Shaken Not Burned. Hello and welcome back to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned. Net zero targets have been a key factor in corporate sustainability strategies. But what we've seen in the last few months is pushback, political argument, difficult decisions about what companies are going to do. But there's never been a more important time for robust, science-aligned frameworks to guide corporate action. The difficulty, as we've all learned, is a target is not necessarily a plan. Too often, pledges are vague and they're inconsistent or difficult to verify. That credibility gap is why the ISO, which is the world standards body, and the GHG protocol have actually just announced a global partnership. They are aligning on the GHG protocols to make sure we understand and harmonise the way in which we report emissions. But more importantly, the ISO is coming out with a net zero standard. That is actually going to be the international standard to explain to every company what they should be doing to have a robust and consistent and believable net zero plan. That might sound like quite a dry topic. Effectively, it's about whether something's auditable or not. But the reality is this could be a turning point because ISO standards don't just live on paper. They shape trade and finance and regulation. Today on Shaken Not Burned, we're asking, can a global standard from a global standards body finally give net zero teeth, and what that might mean for companies, for investors, and for those of us just trying to navigate the sustainability transition. So today we're joined by Noelia Garcia Nebra from the ISO. Noelia, could you start by telling us a little bit about your role at the ISO and why net zero has become such a central focus?
Thank you, Felicia. It's really a pleasure to be with you today talking about this very important topic. So my name is Noelia Garcia Nebra. I'm head of sustainability and partnerships. At ISO, I lead ISO's sustainability strategy to advance our vision of making lives easier, safer, and better, championing ISO standards as practical solutions to urgent sustainability challenges, and forging the strategic partnerships that scale impact.
So that sounds amazing, but for those of our listeners who may not really follow standards that closely, why do international standards matter so much in the fight on climate change?
They matter because I guess those listening will agree that there is a big confusion. Climate change is today's biggest humanity challenge, but there is a lot of confusion in terms of what it means to take action and what can we do to address this big challenge. And that's where actually international standards come in, because they are the tools that turn intention into real action by making the definitions clear, to support consistent efforts that can be comparable, measurable, and can be trusted. Basically, international standards is just a collection of best practices, the best way of doing something. And in the context of climate, this means best way of measuring emissions, best way of verifying the results, and best way of designing technologies that are comparable and usable and interoperable across borders. So it is because they are international tools based on consensus, based on best practices, and underpin on a robust governance that these tools can help support wide action, inform policy, and inform regulation, and most of all, to ensure progress towards a net zero that is real and repeatable and scalable.
And I think one of the things that's important here is the fact that the ISO has been doing this for so long. I mean, can you give me any examples of the kind of standards that you've created that do underpin these fundamental shifts in the way that companies report on things?
Certainly. ISO has been developing standards for more than 80 years now. So we started with standards for screws, basically, and they were very important actually to ensure the reconstruction of the wall after World War II. Since then, we have been developing many different international standards, again, best practices, consensus-based practices in many different areas. But the group of standards that is really well known and has really made an impact in many different industries is actually management system standards. This is a process on how to introduce efficiencies in the operations, being on quality, being on environmental management, being on occupational health and safety. So it's a process that supports companies first decide strategically why introducing those improvements is important, where to identify efficiencies to introduce in operations, and making sure that those improvements are taken in throughout the value chains of any industry. So let me mention some numbers because, as you know, ISO standards are known by numbers. So we have ISO 9001, which is Quality Management System Standards. We do have ISO 14001, Environmental Management System. That's a document that exists since the 90s. So we have been guiding companies into how to assess the impact on environment and how the environment impacts the company since the 90s. So not new in that space. That's to mention probably the most known ones.
So I think possibly for our listeners, for those people who are thinking about how they should approach the challenges associated with understanding their emissions, one of the best known is management systems, means that you actually understand what it's like to work within a business and the different challenges that people face when they're trying to do things. Because I think there are conversations about, well, should you be calculating your carbon footprint by factor or by spend or whatever it might be. But part of the biggest problem is how you actually integrate that into the systems of how a business works. So is that what you're solving, as well as kind of giving recommendations on the best approach for different businesses?
That's exactly where ISO can contribute. On one side, we have standards that help defining things, because what is net zero? You will get as many definitions as people you will ask. So we have standards that clarify that what is net zero. The ISO net zero guideline does that, and the future ISO net zero standard will do that. But then is how do you take the journey of going towards net zero? What are the steps that are needed? What needs to be in place to make sure that you are showing credible, trusted action? And that's where ISO standards based on our management system standards play a role. We have millions of companies today being certified to ISO management system standards. So all these companies already understand that process. Now what the idea will be how to introduce the net zero angle basically to that process. So through those tools, through clear definitions, ways of measuring, and then ways of introducing that into the process of the operations of a company, that's how we can help taking real action.
So that then brings me to the point you mentioned about the definitions of net zero, because personally, I'm very excited that there is a standard for net zero that's going to be published next year. But what does that actually mean? Because there's already a standard for carbon neutral. So could you talk me through why we need two different standards, what they actually mean, and why different companies would choose one or the other?
I mean, the first thing that the standards will do is to clarify what is carbon neutrality and being net zero, because again, these are sometimes used interchangeably, but it is not. So that's already the first thing that companies will be able to do. Like, okay, let me see, like carbon neutrality or net zero. Of course, the high ambition today is net zero, right? But carbon neutrality means that basically one company will balance the greenhouse gas emissions that they produce on a year with an equivalent verified compensation. That's what is carbon neutrality. You compensate what you produce, basically. Net zero, as I said, is a higher ambition concept introduced in the Paris Agreement. And basically what it says is like, well, no, first let's look at where we can reduce emissions as an organization. Most likely, because of technology, etc., that would not be possible 100%. But let's make an effort to reduce those emissions as much as possible. And once we have done that, then we can look at how to compensate the parts of the emissions that we have not been able to reduce. So that's basically the difference. As mentioned, the ambition is net zero. Then industries, according to the sector, according to where they are, they will probably look at one or the other. But of course, we will invite all organizations to higher the ambition as much as possible.
So would it be fair to think of it as the carbon neutral standard, as it is a way of balancing what you do, is part of the journey towards a net zero rather than the end goal?
Yeah, it should be like that. Let's how do we compensate? Well, we'll think about how we can reduce, again, based on technologies and based on other elements. The carbon neutrality standard was created to really start helping organizations in that thinking while we were developing further the standard around net zero. So because here I think that the key message finally is like there is no excuse for anyone to start that journey. So we put the tools in the market to ensure that organizations can start taking those steps. So the carbon neutrality one was in.
One of the challenges is there's such a wide range of understanding in the market of what each of these things mean. So, I'll have conversations where people see carbon neutral as a stronger goal than net zero. But I think a lot of that is around where you set boundaries. So are you talking about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, even scope 4?
So the net zero standard, what is important to say is a standard that is still in the process of being developed. So today, to say exactly what is being said in that standard, it's something I cannot. I can basically.
So can I interrupt for a second and say that what our listeners should do, if they want to follow this discussion, is actually stay on top of what is going on at the ISO, stay on top of what these discussions are, and pay attention, because I think these are really important aspects of how we as an economy move forward with these issues.
Absolutely, yes. That's for me, the key message here. Stay in touch, stay abreast of what's going on. The process is being developed. We are gathering expertise from many different stakeholder from many different parties, from many different parts of the world, to make sure that we have a robust standard that brings really clarity around that area. Now, in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3, maybe I can go back here also to the recently announced partnership between ISO and GHG protocol. Indeed, these are the two most known methodologies today on how to calculate greenhouse gas emissions. GHG protocol talks about scope 1, 2, and 3. ISO's methodology, which is ISO 14064, talks about direct and indirect emissions.
Okay.
So going back to our discussion before about the confusion today in the market, what we are doing through this partnership now is actually trying to merge these concepts and understand what is the easiest and the best way of guiding companies into their calculation of emissions. What's going to come out of that? Again, I cannot say that right now. The two communities are coming together and we'll be discussing that, but the objective is to give the market one unique way of measuring. I don't know, it will be scope 1, 2, and 3. I don't know how it will be. I cannot say that, but it will be a clear understanding on the best way of doing that will serve as a guide for organizations, but also actually for regulators.
Yeah, and that is actually a critical thing, because one of the challenges I find is that direct and indirect emissions seems actually much more logical. If it's direct, it's what you were doing yourself. If it's indirect, it's what you're facilitating. But at the same time, scope 1, 2, and 3 actually helps you with your boundaries, so you know where to stop. So it almost feels as if there's different parts of an organization that might find different approaches useful. So the idea of bringing those together and finding a way that we just learn to do that is incredibly important. One question I do have is, are you looking at how you measure the carbon you displace by the business you're in? if you are a low carbon business, you're a startup, you've invented some incredibly clever technology, which is going to save carbon emissions and methane emissions and water use and all sorts of things. Is that part of the discussion?
These are all certainly discussions being considered. I cannot enter either in the details of those discussions, but these are all big questions that everyone has today. So that's the point of the whole process, right? Like having this large multi-stakeholder discussion around the highest issues or the most important issues around net zero. But here an invitation to be part of the conversation, because if anyone considers that an important topic, then join the conversation. Talk to your national standards body and be part of that conversation.
I have to say, I would love to be a fly on the wall in some of those conversations, because
we will all.
The reality seems to be we are all learning as we go. Things aren't completely black and white. We're doing our best, and as we learn more, we have to change what we do and not judge or get angry or think someone was trying to pull the wool over our eyes, but actually go, we're doing our best, we're trying this, it didn't work, let's try something else. And what you guys are doing is trying to say, these are all the things that everybody's learnt. We're bringing it together and saying, if you want to be credible, you take this route.
Absolutely. And that's where the experts that form the working group today developing that standard come also from organizations that actually will have or would implement that standard. There are regulators, there are academia, there are consultants, there are other organizations, SBTi and other important standard setters in that space are part of these discussions. There is civil society, consumers. So everyone really is around the table. So I think that's the additional value, the real value of what we are doing here.
I think that is the great value of what the ISO does, because it's convenient bringing together all these people who out in the real world might be arguing with each other about what the right or the wrong way is, but in a closed room go, okay, let's see how we can move this forward. Which is actually very exciting and very positive. It's that kind of collaboration that we're always talking about, the fact that we need in the climate space. So, exactly. It's exciting.
But everything else that is around the standard, because, well, on one side already, like the standards get revised regularly. If nothing happens, at least every 5 years, we will review or revise the standard. If we see the area advancing in the industry, in the sectors fast, we can do that faster. The importance that we get out something now to guide organizations, and then afterwards we will review it or revise it as necessary. I think that is around the standard, right? There is a whole governance system that supports the implementation of the standard, and which is what really brings the trust piece, right? Because
of course, and trust is such an important part.
A quality infrastructure around it, which is basically a system of organizations and experts and auditors that exist in the different countries to make sure that the standards are implemented the right way, and that those organizations that implement those standards, that what they claim they do is true.
Yeah.
And it's all done in one same way. So all the auditors verifying and validating that information do that in one same unique way. And I think that's really, really important to bring clarity to that space today.
Certainly, the need for clarity in the carbon footprinting space is immense, because it's dependent on the accounting approach you take. You can come up with very, very different numbers. And while that's explainable to an expert, to any of us who don't work in carbon accounting, the idea that your carbon footprint can change because you've used a different accounting method is really confusing and kind of off-putting. So if you have this common standard that everybody understands and agrees to use, then you don't have that argument of you're comparing apples with alligators. So that's not going to work.
Absolutely. And hopefully also we can, through that partnership also with ISO and the GG protocol, and accompany also some of the regulatory efforts that exist today, for example, carbon board and accounting mechanisms and others, which it is really important that are based on a robust methodology that is also consensus-based.
Yeah, and that's aligned with what people are already doing. So one of the things I'd love to get your thoughts on, the backsliding around net zero commitments? Because for the last, I'd say 5 years, we've had people rushing in to join coalitions to get to net zero, making big commitments to get to net zero. And although you could argue that to a certain extent politics has got a role, do you think that's all it is? I mean, from your perspective, what do you think is causing some of the backsliding around corporate net zero?
I mean, some of the initiatives you were mentioning, I think they have been really important because we needed to act fast. So there was no time for contemplation, let's say. But in this, they have created at the same time a lot of confusion. In my opinion, there are a number of 4 things basically that create that confusion. The first one will be what good looks like. Like what does it mean to do a good net zero transition plan? That's the first one. So going back to the definitions aspect. The second one will be uncertainty on how to measure progress. Again, there are different scopes, different methods, different data quality. So what does it mean really? How can we really measure progress and progress that is comparable? So that would be the second challenge or backsliding. The third one for me would be limited verification and governance around credible action. So a lot of claims, but which ones are real? Which ones are based on something robust?
And so would that almost be that why would you spend all the money to do all the reporting and implement your targets when you can't get robust verification that everybody in the market will believe? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yes, but is definitely going to be our phrase of the day.
So in the sense that reporting is absolutely necessary and very important. It really helps companies give a sign to the market on what they are doing, right? However, I always say reporting is the very last thing that any organization is going to do. Again, it will give a sign to investors. It's important that all these reportings are harmonized so that investors can really compare one company to another, one report to another. That's very important. But we really need to make sure that this reporting is linked to the real economy, to what organizations are really doing. So we also need to verify and validate this piece. I mean, we need to verify, of course, the reportings, but we also need to verify the way the organizations, for example, are measuring their greenhouse gas emissions, the way the organizations are developing their net zero transition plans. And that's where the ISO standards come in, really in the action piece of the organization. One, this is robust. Then you will have companies really being able to report advances, to report progress. And then if all organizations do this reporting the same way, of course, that's going to be much easier for the market to understand. But we cannot separate reporting from the real operations of the organization. Okay. So the third one was, of course, verification and governance. To make sure that we can say who is taking real credible action. And the fourth one, it was how can we make the business for net zero easily understandable and frame it simply so that leaders can really take action and deliver and monitor on them. So that would be my 4 areas where that I think are really creating confusion. And that's what we are doing with the international standard on net zero. We have more than 80 years of experience bringing best practices into business as usual through international standards. Yeah. We can disseminate that best practice to everyone so that it's not only 1,000 companies, but 1 million companies or more, hopefully, that can take that action.
And I love that, actually, because if you are able to make comparisons, say, across 1 million companies about where people are on their performance in a world of climate risk, resource scarcity, whatever it might be that's a concern, we're seeing shifts in cost of capital for corporates. We're seeing shifts models. And actually, if you can show that the actions you're taking are moving the company in the right direction, that might result in an ability to raise capital at a lower cost or get better insurance rates or a green bond or whatever it might be. And is that the goal, to enable that kind of shift in the market overall?
It is exactly that. It is to show that taking action on net zero makes business sense. It's a journey. Again, it's nothing that you can do from one day to another. It's of course a journey, but it makes business sense and it gives a huge sign to the market, to investors, that you are doing and let's not forget, I mean, there is more and more pressure from investors, from regulators, but also for consumers, for organizations to take care of their impacts on climate. So it does make business sense.
Well, I think there's a phrase that I've heard a lot. I mean, specifically around the fossil fuel industry, but I think is just part of the way our economy works, is that a lot of companies, they take the profits from business, but they socialize the costs, simply meaning that they're not paying for the externalities of their impact. And I think more and more people are becoming aware of this and looking at businesses and saying, well, okay, I'm giving you my money. What are you doing with it? What are the end results? Are you polluting the waterways? Are you emitting really heavily? And I think this is a very important part of that process. But I'm fascinated on another level, because you talked about the regulators' involvement and the fact that we're on a journey. Net Zero Tracker, actually, I remember they used this brilliant phrase, which was a governance conveyor belt. This is where voluntary action gets turned into mandatory action and regulation. Mm-hmm. So where does the ISO fit in that process?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the conveyor belt, which is indeed a theory of change from the Oxford University. And it basically describes how we move from private voluntary initiatives to policy and regulation to achieve net zero. So how the ambition grows. So it's like a step process, right? And actually international standards are a key, crucial element of that process, because it's by leveraging international standards that we can move actually from private voluntary initiatives to regulations to achieve net zero. Because international standards, ISO standards, they translate that what initially was private voluntary consensus-based initiatives, international standards, they will always remain voluntary, let's say, in nature, always. However, they are recognized by the WTO Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement as important tools to allow governments to regulate, because they have the right to regulate. But the TBT agreement does call for governments to use international standards as a way of regulating without creating unnecessary barriers to trade. So international standards bring together all this knowledge used by private initiatives, voluntary initiatives, and then regulators can take it and use it to support the implementation of a policy objective. So the regulator will define the what, where do we want to go? In this case, 1.5 degrees, right? But here the question is the how. How do we get there? And that's where the international standards come in, because they explain the how to get there based on best practices, knowledge base. So as you see, it's kind of like the link, right, between what initially could be a private initiative, an initiative of few, into something much wider, with a wider ambition and with a wider impact.
I think I'm always saying it's very important, but what's key about this is there is so much information about where we need to be, whether it's planetary boundaries, whether it's the donut. We know where we need to be, but the how of how we get there is the thing that everybody is struggling with. And so any move that actually translates that into actual action and help to getting people to move in that direction can only be a really positive thing. One thing I will say is that I'm going to look out the Oxford explanation of the conveyor belt of governance, and I'm going to add that to the show notes, because I think, apart from anything else, I'd be fascinated to read it, but I think it could be really useful for our listeners as well. So one of the questions I think that does come up is, why is this something we can consider the first truly international, independently verifiable net zero standard? Because how does it differ from the voluntary initiatives like the SBTI or the Race to Zero, or these different groups that have come together?
Okay, I think there are three key aspects of ISO standards and the system we bring in that are key in showing what is different. The first one is international by design, based on consensus of a number of different multi-stakeholders, not only on one sector, but many different sectors, many different categories of stakeholders. Many different countries will bring the voice of developing countries to the process, which is something that does not happen in the development of other.
So important for anything to be truly effective.
Absolutely. So like this, we can give one globally really agreed benchmark that can be used across sectors, sizes of organizations, regions, etc. So that's the first one. The second one is independently verifiable. ISO does not do the verification or the validation of the standard. It gives the elements to be able to be verified and validated by a third party that is accredited in the country according to certain rules that are equal throughout the globe. So this is also super important for then the third element, which is trust at scale. That's how we can, and that rules are proof equally around the world, that we can cut greenwashing. We know what we are talking about. We know the claims are valid and robust. And as I said before, we can enable policy making and procurement actually aspects, which is another.
And procurement actually is really interesting because that's a huge lever for change. But that then brings up in my mind a question, because one of the arguments for regulation of very large businesses is the cascade effect, that they turn around and ask for information from their suppliers, who then turn around and ask for information from their suppliers, and that you get this flow throughout the supply chain. Does the standard have anything specific, or will it have anything specific for SMEs? Because I think sometimes we talk about big business because they have the biggest impact, but the largest number of businesses, I mean, I think it's in the UK, over 80% of businesses are under 10 people. So what are you doing with those of us who are smaller?
It's a very, very good question. I mean, already the international standard, as I mentioned before, is made for any organization of any sector of any size. But we understand that small and medium companies have additional challenges. And that's why in the context of the ISO Net Zero standard, we are working on developing a specific annex that will offer proportionate guidance for smaller companies. But already the fact, again, if big companies, small companies use the same standard, like they are speaking the same language. So that's already very, very important. But yeah, we will have an annex to make sure that SMEs can follow that guidance as well.
I think actually that question of language is probably not talked about enough, because I do remember a company I was working with a few years ago. They turned around and they asked some of their suppliers for information so they could start reporting, and the suppliers didn't really know what they were talking about, let alone the complexity that you can get into when you get into the technical details of a standard or carbon accounting. So actually a shared language is almost that first step for anyone and everyone to move forward in a useful way. That's a fascinating idea.
So already, like if big companies share the standard they are applying to themselves with their suppliers, that would be already a very good thing.
Yes, definitely. Now, I wanted to ask about the net zero guidelines, because obviously that was the precursor to the standards that you're working on at the moment. And as I understand it, they've already been used by organisations as distinct as GM and the FIA. What has the feedback been like? What have you learned from the early adopters about what's going on?
A number of lessons learned, certainly, that are actually now being feeding, right, the development of the new full international standard. Maybe a few things to highlight based on that experience. The first one is net zero is a journey. It's not from today to tomorrow. It's a journey, and the company needs to take the decision of entering in that journey. It takes time, resources, and most importantly, senior buy-in. Without senior buy-in, it's not gonna happen, but it needs to be integrated throughout the operations and the value chain of the organization. The other important element is what I said before, there is a business case, and the business case is strong. It's about setting up your organization to manage risks, to be future-proofed, and to remain resilient and profitable in a very changing world. And the third aspect I would highlight is there is a need and a demand from the market. I mentioned it a bit before because of the confusion. As I said, like there is really a big demand for a credible, certifiable net zero standard. So we were implementing the guidelines. It's been really useful to organizations such as the ones you mentioned, but we heard back we need the verification and the validation piece attached to it. And that's why we initiated the development of the actual standard.
So that piece, is that what, just trying to think of how to describe it, the term, is that what's meant by the quality infrastructure surrounding the standard itself? Because you've talked about the independence.
Exactly.
But I suppose what matters is that it's within an ecosystem that actually has all these different elements that play a role, that are understood and accepted by different actors in that ecosystem, be it the regulators or the investors or government procurement departments, whatever it might be.
Exactly, because a company can say, I'm doing that and I'm doing it like that. And that's good. It's already good, right? That the company claims how we're doing that. But we need the third-party verification and validation. Yeah. We need the structure behind it. People that is trained and formed and certified actually to do this kind of the additional clarity, the additional trust that is needed in all these claims. So that's what the ISO standard and the national quality infrastructure, everything around it will bring.
And this brings me to one of the most difficult issues around net zero. Can you explain the strongest business case for actually engaging and using the standard?
I mean, climate change is a reality. We have to accept that. And organizations, they see the impacts of climate change in their operations. So this goes both ways, right? It's how climate is impacting the operations of the organization and how the organization is impacting climate. So that's a reality. My call here would be the sooner an organization starts assessing those impacts, understanding them, managing them, internalizing them, the better. The more resilient they will be, the more future-proof they will be, the higher the opportunity to remain competitive in the market. And yeah, we know also it's a little bit volatile in today's world. But organizations should not be waiting for that to stabilize, to do something that actually makes business sense, to give an indication to their investors and to their consumers that they are taking important action in that.
And I think that's somewhere that I see some of the most interesting potential for action, which is this desire to be resilient, this desire to be future-proof, because it's almost as if what we're going through at the moment is a sort of spasm of reaction. I think the combination of rising emissions and negative impacts on biodiversity and all of these interconnected elements coming together are what will drive companies to understand they operate within a system. You can't operate a business independent of nature and society and the economy because it's all in and out all over the place. And listeners may not have seen this, but the ISO has actually launched its biodiversity standard as well. So if you're concerned about dependencies on nature, you should definitely go and check that out. But back to the net zero standard. The standards are voluntary. We've talked about how they can move forward and how it might be part of the process of governments adopting them. This is similar to my earlier question, but how should companies think about acting now or waiting for regulation?
And it's pretty much what I said before, is about maybe not thinking only on the short term, but on the medium and longer term as an organization. How can I ensure I keep my competitiveness in the market? I'm sure if an organization does an assessment of how climate risks are impacting their organization, they will identify a few. So it's about deciding, like, do I do nothing, or I look at this and see how I can act upon.
I suppose in some ways it's about a company deciding what role they want to play, who they want to be. That to me is, I think, again, a very important thing, because companies often talk about purpose, but what does that actually mean, and how do you show that you're not just talking, but you're actually committed to change? If we have a standard and we are talking about its role in the move from voluntary to regulatory implementation, do you think having the standard is going to change the extent to which companies are engaging in greenwashing? Because if you look at the analysis over the last again, the last 6 months to a year, companies have got quieter and quieter about their action on climate, their action on sustainability, on DEI, all sorts of different things, without necessarily actually stopping what they're doing. They're just not talking about it. But of course, one of the things that encourages behavioural change is seeing other people do it. So we don't want green hushing. We want people to be able to talk about the amazing things they're doing. Do you think having this standard will help that happen?
I hope so. I hope it will do, because again, the clarity it will bring, setting clear rules, reducing legal and reputational risks, the fact that it can be comparable. It's also an area where can motivate organizations to show what they are doing. But also, because of what I was saying before, this is about the journey. This is not about tomorrow I'm going to be net zero. That's not what the standard says. The standard is about the journey, about how me as an organization, as a company, I'm starting this journey. What am I looking at? How am I planning to get there? Not by tomorrow. We understand that takes time. So hopefully that pathway and that way of looking at it and having clear guidelines on how to look at it gives confidence to organizations that the pathway is possible, and hopefully they will be something to be proud of and that they can talk about a bit more.
Now, I think we'd be remiss when mentioning possible pathways not to talk about COP30, which is coming up in Belém. This for you is probably going to be a very big moment for consultation, for bringing different people on board. What kind of input are you hoping to see from businesses, from policymakers, and from civil society?
I know that the current presidency is really focused on action. We know it's a difficult moment today for those discussions. Not sure whether there will be big outcomes coming up from COP30, but from the discussions we have followed and what we have heard from the COP presidency, their focus is really to help understand what everything that has been discussed until now around COP really lands into the day-to-day of everyone, how this really links to our daily life. So how can we really advance action and take meaningful steps towards net zero? So in that context, really are championing ISO standards as those practical tools that can help with that ambition. We will have a standards pavilion together with other 18 partners coming together to show that international standards is the how-to. Is how
Amazing.
is really something practical. And implementable. In terms of the net zero standard, the working group is working really, really hard to advance those discussions. You can imagine it's not easy discussions, but we hope by COP30 to have a better understanding of when the public consultation will be out. In any case, for us, COP30, the Standards Pavilion with a number of sessions actually also on the net zero standards. So I invite everyone to visit us and see the program at standardspavilion.org to come and join, because these are also important moments for us to listen also to our more stakeholders on what they are looking for, what gaps they might exist, and be able also to share information on where our work is going.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I know that you can't tell me when exactly the standard will come out for public consultation, but we are working towards early 2026, right?
Yes, and we are working towards a publication in 2026. Early, I'm not sure, but certainly a publication in 2026. I mean, the working group is meeting right now, so we'll see where the discussions go.
Now, one of the things I did mention the biodiversity standard, and I think one of the questions that I would like to ask, because of the fact that we, as an economy, as society, as a people, we have recognized that real change and net zero itself is going to be impossible if we only look at emissions. We have to look at the interconnected nature of the world in which we live. So beyond carbon, how is the ISO thinking about the integration of biodiversity and nature and even just transition into the net zero journey?
So that's early stages to tell, but certainly now that we have our first ISO standards around biodiversity out that set the general principles on how organizations should be looking at nature, how they should be setting targets and setting the governance, etc. Now it's the moment of joining the forces. So we will join the experts that are looking at the net zero work with the experts looking at biodiversity to have those discussions and see how those things can be connected. There is some important work coming up in terms of natural capital, etc. But that's actually what the ISO system does, right? Even if there might be different working groups at some point developing specific standards, we do create links between those to see how those things interconnect, where are the dependencies and joint efforts. For example, I have some joint work between our experts developing the standards on circular economy and then our experts looking at climate. So they are jointly looking at how those things inter.
Which I think is wonderful, because it's not just being aware of the positive interconnections, but it's also understanding the potential downsides and the trade-offs that might exist between emissions reduction and biodiversity protection or whatever it might be. And I think clarity on that is going to make a real difference to certainly how citizens and consumers look at the world, but also I think really help companies understand what it is they're looking at and what it is they need to do. So on that note, I will bring our conversation to a close, just to say thank you so much, Noelia. It's been really interesting listening to you. And to our listeners, just remember that the new ISO Net Zero standard could well mark a turning point, because it's going to provide a shared language for accountability, credibility, and climate action. And as Noelia has explained so clearly, it's not just a question of setting targets. It's about creating a global baseline for what progress looks like. Standards like this are going to give governments, investors, and companies the confidence to move faster and together. So, thanks for listening to Shaken Not Burned, where we explore the systems, signals, and stories shaping a resilient future. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll be back soon.